So today I will be talking about SOMA and searching for gameplay in that game. This was a very lengthy, the development took 5 years process, and I can't go into all of the details. So it's going to be a high level view. I'm also trying to remember everything, that like there's a lot of details. I'm sure I'm missing something out, but overall should give a good overview of the difficulties in developing that game, especially the high level, merging the high level aspects with gameplay. And it's going to be some spoilers along the way. So, if you haven't played a game you want to be doing, perhaps you want to play the game first. All of that said, here goes. We need to start with this guy and Amnesia as a takeoff point. And when developing Amnesia at the end of it, or when making the final plans for that game, the idea popped up for the storyline, which was that we wanted to have a sort of thematic that merged well with the game. And the idea was this of good versus evil, or really the nature of evil. Like, can anyone become evil and so on? We tend to think of ourselves as the heroes in the stories we play, and even more so in the games that we play. So it felt very, very interesting to have a storyline from this where the player was in the mind, because that's sort of what you are in a first-person game, of the protagonist, and saw everything from their viewpoint. And there you had this idea of starting with a memory and starting then out as the hero of the story, and then figuring out during the course of the game that you were more and more complicit to the crimes you were seeing. And that felt like a very interesting thing. And in the end, I was honestly a bit disappointed by how this got through. I mean, some people thought about it. There was some very interesting replies in all this where people defended Daniel, saying that, well, if you lost his memory, he's no longer that person, so therefore he didn't really commit those crimes, so I can't be blamed for them, or I, the player, the protagonist, can't be blamed for them. But overall, people were like, lots of spooky monsters there's here. So that was sort of the main takeaway. Not so much the themes, but the spooky monsters. That's okay. The game was supposed to be a horror game, and I mean, a lot of the feedback and whatever afterwards was celebrating how scary it was. But for me personally, I was annoyed by we couldn't get the thematics right. What we did learn, though, was that by very small means, an audio cue playing or something like that, we could make things travel into the player's brain. We could put ideas into their head. We could take this idea of a monster, put them into the head of the player by using very simple means. And that was... I didn't expect at the beginning that it would be that easy. And we had scenes. I remember one scene, which was the study, I think the map is called, where we had lots of spooky events. And then in the end, it was like, you don't need those. The player can just walk through the place, some sound effects play, and they're going to make up all this in their own mind. That was really, really cool. And it's sort of made me think, okay, what more can we do with this? So what's the next step here? The next step for me personally wasn't making a more scary game. That was like, no, we're gonna do something harder here. This is gonna be more interesting. And my thinking was, what other themes can we do? So I have always been, since I started 12, 13, something, very, very interested in philosophical stuff. And read a lot of books on it, etc. So I thought, could you take these ideas and put them into a game? So normally in a movie or whatnot, the audience is standing next to and sort of looking from a third-person view. And my thinking was, could we instead have them inside, be part of the experience, so that they're in an actual thought experiment. This was the idea. So could we like have something which at the beginning, I mean, no one knew what that would be, but that's something. In Amnesia, this was a sound effect. But here it was something unknown at this point. We could take that, and that travels all the way into the player's mind, and that's what takes this idea and puts it into their head. So this was the startup, and the sort of following structure came to be. First up, a mystery. So the mystery here is that you are in present day, and then suddenly after a brain scan, you're somewhere else in another time, like in the future, another time. And the idea here was to take, and mysteries are really good because the players start thinking about them. They become the core of the experience. Like in a detective novel or whatever, you're constantly thinking, who did it? And when the protagonist meets a new person, is like, could this be the culprit? And so on. Want to have the same thing here. So the players should be thinking about this mystery as they play it, and that should be a big part of their experience. And then what we would have somewhere in the middle would be a confrontation where you really, you learn the ideas, you learn what it all was here around, but you would confront it in the middle with a sort of copy thing. That I knew from the beginning. Very early on, we would have the player transferred to another body, and then the old body, there being some confrontation with the old body, with their old self. So confrontation both thematically and with their past self. So that was the next step. And then we have the final step, which was that you would have sort of like the initial idea was a choice between the being still in the flesh but in a miserable existence, but then being in the abstract realm, like digital realm, but in a nicer existence. That sort of changed along the development. It became more like a choice. There is still the two choices because there is a split in how the protagonist receives. It's just that you see both of them in the game, so it's almost like a multiple ending game, but you see all of the endings. You don't have to go to YouTube and look them up afterwards, which, I mean, that's what I do in many cases. Anyway, so you have them both. In a way, it's like that in the end, where you're sort of left behind in the flesh or in the abstract. And both of those have their issues, right? There's nothing, like in this case, that like being left alone is the worst, but in the initial it was going to be more of a choice. But nevertheless, the idea is that there's this idea of a flow here, which is mystery, give the players something to think about, confront them with this mystery, like really hit it home. What this mystery is like, make them confront this. Hopefully there's another thing here which is sort of implicit as well, is I talked about this idea of the player being inside the protagonist's head, the like thing we saw in Amnesia, and we want to take full advantage of that. So a lot of this time was spent like taking the player here and putting them into the mind of the protagonist, so they had maximum effect when this happened. Similarly, in this case here, so just building up that sense of presence, as we call it, which is really a really deep subject on its own, and I'll have to make another video about that another time. But just, immerse yourself thinking you're someone else. That's what we're talking about. And then the other thing then, having that, so how do we frame this as a player journey, as a story, as a narrative? And then the idea here was sort of twofold. They're similar. So one first is road trip. So you start in one place and you go to some final destination with some goal in mind. Here it's like saving humanity was early on. All of that changed a bunch during development, but something like that. And then you meet all of these weird characters, which is also the sort of second, which is some sort of Alice in Wonderland type of experience. So you see them. So a lot of early tests was just what sort of characters can you meet and so on and so forth. And the idea was basically that on your journey, you have all of these thematic bits. So all of these represent some sort of thought experiment, some interesting aspects of what the whole consciousness idea. Some of these were like a bit novel or ingrained in the game world. Other were like actual philosophical things, experiments that I've that read about in literature and so on, so that we tried and do in game form, which was a bit scary because I haven't really seen it. You had some that had these sort of things, like the Suffering, if I recall that name correctly, and we're in a prison. You have some of these sort of moral dilemmas that you've had a bit of it, but not overt philosophical experiments. The only one I could find during research, which is also another line, like I need to talk a little bit about the research being done for this game at some point, was a game called The Chinese Room, same as the game company, where you actually go through a sort of philosophical experiments in that game, but it's made in a very it's more like Monkey Island style adventure game. It's a text adventure game, and it really didn't have the impact that we were looking for, but it was an interesting thing in how you phrased this. It were very overtly philosophical thought experiences, almost like you'd had to know a bit of background. You need to know what the Mary experiment is in order for you to enjoy it, and that we didn't want. So you shouldn't have to go in with some sort of philosophy degree to understand. So okay, all of this was our basic structure. Now came the hard part, which was play, which is weird, right? So we spent a lot of time now talking about presence, the story, and this is a game, right? And I haven't mentioned play. So how do we do? And this was a huge issue, and this is really where problems start stacking up. So obviously, we wanted players to feel this sense of presence. They had to do something here. We couldn't just have the game be 3 scenes, right? There had to be more, and also we had to build up an understanding of the concepts involved. The players come into this game with very different backgrounds in terms of what they believe and what knowledge they have on this beforehand. So some might have never thought about this before, some others have thought about it a lot, which was also interesting, and how reactions were. Some figured it out very early on, and some not until the very end, some never. It's interesting. Also something that I should perhaps talk about at another point, not today. So yeah, the problem was, what do we fill this with? So we at least knew some stuff, and one thing was, okay, we want the player to stick their head into these thematics, right? This first-person view, this agency players have, is very interesting in games. This is what we're gonna use. This is what is gonna drive the whole experience forward. So what do we have? So we have the body swap. Can't do that much. In fact, the body swap is part of all the big moments, so we're basically spent it. But that's a very easy thing to do. What else do we have? So we have time slips. So you can have, player blacks out, and we don't have to show that blackout, but just time skips, which is an interesting way of first-person experience, the sense of continuity when it stops working, which you don't do in everyday life, which is interesting. That also was a pretty meager thing to do. I think we use it quite a bit. There's one enemy type purely devoted for this, and several moments in a game where this happens. They had other characters happen to them, and then it happens to you. But again, all of these things require so much context for them to have impact, and so it's hard to use it. The thing that we can use the most is just this being inside another head. That was sort of like constantly. That could be a constant reminder. Simple things like the mirror scene could be done through that. But again, there's not. You can say I am this person. This is not. It's sort of like an implicit gameplay element. It's not that you don't like. It doesn't. None of these, which I think is very clear. It's not like simple. You have a gun. Well, now all of a sudden you have a gameplay mechanic. None of these are like, wow, we have a really cool gameplay mechanic here. There were initial thoughts on having gameplay mechanics. There was something about you can't trust reality style, but all of that fell through because it became so gimmicky. Like again, if you focus too much on it, it's also just not going to be interesting anymore. It just becomes sort of fluffy, and not like into the story. You see it mechanically. So in the end, a lot of it had to be experienced third hands. This is annoying because that wasn't what you wanted. So in a way, which is this had to be filled up with the experiences, or partly or mostly with the experiences where you like are not that interesting, and then sort of just serve as build up to these other things. But that was sort of known. So okay, so question now is, what do we do? Like, what are these thematic points? And the first idea, because in my head, and also thinking about this way too much, I guess, in previous games, was that we want to stay clear of repetitive play, which I think honestly went too all in on this, but that was the idea at that point. So no repetitive play, trying to have everything fresh, and so the idea was that there were some scenes, events, scenarios, what you want to call them. Then a player went to them, did some stuff, and then jumped to the other scenario, and then sort of adventure game like. Yeah, that was the idea, and we had some of that in older games, and it felt like, yeah, how hard can it be? So all of these scenes were made up by all of these custom parts. That was the plan for them to be sort of customly made, and we started out doing that, and oh boy, came pile of complexity. Yeah? And what happens is that so let me take 2 examples just of how messed up this became. So early on, an idea that I thought was, I mean, it sounds cool when you say it, is you wake up in, so you're at Munch's office at the beginning of the game, and the idea was that you woke up there first, but this was a facade made by the WoW in order for you to feel comfortable, but it sort of like breaks down. So you had it, and the idea here, why do we do that? Because this becomes a play space, because we needed these custom parts to have any sort of play going on. And another thing that was you had some monster, and player could go up and you turn on power, and you would be able to electrocute that monster. So these sort of scenes played out, and in order to test these, right, we had to like do a lot of scripting. Art assets needed to be in and tested. It was hard to really test them in white box, so you had to do a lot of stuff. And the moment we did that, the complexity just went up, and it was this sort of, Avery had this process that spiraled out of control for this setup. Every gameplay required like secret tunnels. Then you had to explain the secret tunnels by some storyline, and then that new storyline required some other gameplay aspect, and it just didn't work. It just became a big mess. Or it did. At first, it thought that it could work, but it was really messy to do, and you had to jump through all of these hoops. Similarly with the electricity, like just setting it all up, making sure the player doesn't miss it, giving other opportunities and so on. And then again, that needs to be another custom opportunity, or you just get into this sort of like boring, for us at least, boring adventure style puzzle. But the thing is, most players were really confused when they tried early versions of this. I remember a friend going is really into like really good at thinking about the design and so on, and he the first thing he said to me was, "Wow, this game does I can't really know where it fits in, what kind of genre this is." And that was his thoughts. Like the themes were like, didn't think about those. There was so much stuff happening at the beginning of the game that we had to have to just make these scenes feel interesting, because that was, we had to have these parts to have this sort of interesting play space. But also because everything was unique and new. The players, they never really got into this sort of immersion loop. They never really got immersed and got into character. So all of this started falling through. So had to do some other way. And the thing, again, I said before, we're saying again, the thing we missed was a core loop at the bottom of it all. And I have another video on core loops, but basically it's something that's foundational to the game, which has a sequence of assessing the situation, planning a plan, and then executing that plan in some way. So as in Super Mario, you see a pit, you assess, if I fall down there, I'm gonna die, so I plan to jump over it, and you then try to jump over it. So it's like 3 sequences, and in some games these are really fast, others they're very slow and drawn out. We didn't have that, and what happens then is you're very top heavy, and you have nothing to catch that. It just falls through. There's nothing grounding it, and you have to constantly just build up custom parts for every part of the game. It's not working. And so the thing that sort of, I can't really recall when this went in, because it wasn't like a on the spot decision, but it was more like a gradual thing that came through. And this is also, when you talk about these things, it sounds like one idea, but it can be 100 ideas over a longer span of time. But I'm compressing it now to get a sense. And some of this is also like a bit ad hoc, me thinking through, and I wasn't as knowledgeable about the situation when I was in it as I am now looking back at it like 10 or more years later. And so we had the monsters in, and we added them in. We had monsters before, but not as a sort of like, again, it was like electrocuting them, but it's more like, get back to Amnesia basics, let's do that. And so now this path the player took, filled with monsters, and that gave us the core loop. It gives us this core loop, and now all of a sudden the player, like we get the player in there. We get the immersion loop going. Immersion loop is another concept. Like I need to get into that some other time, but right now though, we get the player immersed into the game. But this came with its own problems, focusing so much on monsters. And the big one was that we had these design attractors. So constantly you're drawn in directions that wasn't towards this thematic goal of having a philosophically challenging game. And that was really tough, especially when your development time is so drawn out that you have, this is over 5 years. It's very hard to stay focused on this, especially when you have during development some teasing, the monster's here. And at the back of my head, I constantly had people saying, or me saying, it's like, is this the new water lurker sequence? Is this going to be the new thing that people say? Really, really bad things to have in my head. It's like totally not helping out at all, just making everything worse. The other thing is that now we have these monsters, but we had already a bunch of stuff pre-built. How do we slot it in? So there's a lot of retrofitting, to make it work, like especially earlier levels. I'm not sure that's noticeable that much, but earlier levels like Theta, the monster encounters there were not really meant for monster encounters. You had to figure out various ways of making it work, which was hard work, and restrained you from doing interesting stuff. Sometimes good, but mostly bad. So then we came, okay, so we still need to get the damn thematics across. So idea here was, okay, so we have the monsters. That creates presence. That's good. We need that for our scenes. The player needs to be present. They need to feel like the character. So monsters create that really well. Because the players are afraid of them. There's a lot of ways then they do that. So what if we just have information spread across, players thinks about that as they play? Okay, didn't happen. So thematics just woohoo flies past most players. They're not engaging in them enough. So we had some scenes still, like where the player needs to solve puzzles around it and so on. But overall, there was a lack of engagement. Then an idea came about. So 3 different ways that came about. So one was, and this sort of gives you a sense of how late into the process all of this was. I can't recall the year, but there was a previewer that was really like sad about seeing the robot. I had like this fun memories of Spec Ops, the line scenes where you had to like a scene I really like is there's a crowd coming towards you and you can sort of, do I shoot at them, or then there's like a hidden choice shooting in the air, so that it feels analog. There's not like a yes or no question that pops up. You have to make a decision. And you also just thinking about Amnesia Justine, where you had there was very interesting and fun setting up those puzzles where you had to choose whether to save or kill someone. So from that came, we already had characters that you meet. So the thing then was, what if the player gets to decide whether they live or die? And suddenly engagement got back into the players. This is very simple. It feels a bit stupid. I mean, not stupid, but it's like but every choice is that. Even more interesting is how you do that. There's almost all of the choices of killing has this exact same interaction, which is pulling a cable. And that also came from an early event where we did that because it fit the puzzle, and it's like, oh, we can have pulling the cable like something that you do to murder things. So players could, like, there was an affordance to killing NPCs, which was nice. You could, there's a cable, and if I unplug it, they die. So that came about really nicely, and that was not obvious at all at the start. So we have now starting to get a sense of what to do in these spaces, and we have this sort of like using, and this was the key part, I guess, for this, or not guess, I know, which was that as players gathered information, that then sort of informed their choices. So very important. And it felt like a need to engage with that information way more than before. And we had this sort of monster that gave engagement. But the play loop was still, I was like, it felt like we were really building upon this right now with all of this, but still we weren't really there. I felt, but this had to be enough. But and you have to like understand. I mean, this is like 3 years in or something. We had a production that was speeding forward. So whenever you had a nice idea, you had to like, this had to go up here while everything's going forward. It's not easy doing this. And a good example of things that I think could have been much better. And the information bit was, especially when it comes to monsters, that we should use information to inform players on how to handle encounters. So every monster has their own unique way of behaviors, and you have to then, by having information, you can more easily get past them. But that sort of like didn't really work, and it was this one, and it was really hard getting them in. You had to like, could we have a note here? Could we have this? And then you could sort of like change some of the scenes and so on. But overall, it was quite hard. Also, we had this sort of, another good example was these healing stations, and the idea was that if you chose to heal yourself, something else in the environment would break, and that would, the players would think about what they did first and so on, just engaging them more in the environment. But that also, like, too late, and was hard to get in. And so overall, we wanted to like fill this gameplay bucket all the way up, but we only got to a certain point. And that sort of meant when it came to, say, monsters, that some people really enjoyed and others didn't. But in the end, though, we managed to get the bottom layer going. I mean, it's duct taped, it's fitting together all of these pieces that we had to piece in while our production was running at full speed and already fully loaded. But we managed, and that's sort of how the game turned out. But I mean, I wish I could have done better. And so I want to like talk about what we can learn from this. And my main thing is this whole idea of, if you have a high level, and that's the top of your sort of approach, and you need to make sure that you have this loop that supports that built in somehow, because otherwise you can't have this immersion, can't have the engagement and so on. You have to make sure you have that in, and you need to think about that at an early stage, even though that's really hard. So it's much easier to say in a shooter. In a shooter, you have like a 5-second loop, like pew pew, avoid bullet, shoot ship, perhaps not even 5 seconds. And whereas we had like I guess you want to call it the meta loop, because it's composed of other loops, which was the whole thing: gather information and then choose who lives or dies. That was really a loop. That's what the game is all about, throughout the whole game. But that wasn't clear until the game was almost finished. So it's very hard, like making sure that works. And then like the supportive loops, the core loop was this running away from monsters. But in the end, and I think if we had gotten the other stuff in even more so, we released this safe mode where the monsters weren't that dangerous, and that helped out a lot, especially when you think about from a pure design attractor thing. Which I also have another video if you want to get more into that. But then instead of like diverging us from our goal, they were more like in line, not exactly, but more like in line with our thematic goals, which was easier. But that came like after the game was released. So it was never something we did while working on it. So just some other notes before wrapping up. So you might think, wait a second, this is not how you're supposed to build a game. You're supposed to do it bottom up. You're supposed to first find the fun, and then you can figure out the themes. And it's like, yeah, but I'm not sure you can do that in this type of game. Like, I'd love to see someone try and not have your themes being killing things or something like it. So that's just basically some sort of iteration on what you're doing. Which is what most games that have higher level themes, like Last of Us, does. Not most, or at least when you have a tight core loop, themes end up being like, perhaps you shouldn't be killing so much, or something like it. If you want to have philosophical thought experiments, it's very hard to like, yeah, you have to start here. And also the moment you do this, even though you say, well, we're gonna have some platforming, shooting, or whatnot, but you're still gonna have this theme. Like, good luck with the design attractors during that, because that's gonna be really hard judging anything, because you don't know at that point what's gonna drive you towards the thematic goal, like your high level goal or not. So you're gonna be sucked in on these sort of bottom things very early on. The other thing you might say then, but come on, the solution is obvious. You do the top and bottom together. A little bit top, a little bit bottom, so on and so forth. That's sort of what we did. The thing is, sometimes you have months of iteration time between these. It's not as simple as just building a white box. You have to have writing, assets, design, thinking about it. Can take a really long time getting all of this together, updating the systems and so on. I mean, and the moment you start doing some of this top level stuff, you have your production truck going. This is not going to be fun for the team or for you, for anyone really. It's going to be chaos. You can do it, but it's going to take forever to get anything done if you want a longer game and so on. So you have to make choices early on and sort of try and stick with them, or try and do it as you go along. Otherwise, you guys can have chaos. So the thing, I think, the takeaway for me, the thing that I'm thinking a lot about now is you want to be thinking a bit differently about your core loops, or as said, the gameplay loops you're using. In a shooter, you have you have these sort of small time scales. So you have like a few seconds. In something like a stealth sneaker game, you have longer. It could be minutes of like hiding, planning, assassinating, so on. But in a game like this, where it's all about theme, we have to go even further. Perhaps we can't be bogged down by just thinking about it as a 1 minute 5 second loop. That's game. You need something there. That I'm sure of. You need something that grounds it, but that can't be the entirety of your gameplay loop. That can be your sort of core loop, but that core loop needs to be part of something bigger. And so if you don't do that, you sort of risk having, very top heavy thing that's just gonna plow the way through. Like, you don't have a bottom here. You're not gonna get the experience you're looking for. It's gonna fall flat. I mean, there's games that sort of works here, to be honest. But I mean, I think this is a very risky business going on, especially if you want it more playable. If you like remove any play, I mean, you can. There's not a lot of risk in it, but overall, if you want it gameplay to happen, you need to have something more solid here. And the other thing is, what I talked about, if you just go bottom up, is that you're gonna have a bottom that just takes up all the mental space, and then the top is like just attached to it. So the aim here really is to have this unity. This is what we're going for. The high level has a low level that supports it in some manner. And we sort of got that for SOMA. It's not perfect. It barely holds together in some places. And I wish we could have done better. It was an interesting learning experience, but still we managed to get a lot of teams across. Like we got the sort of playable aspects and so on. But I mean, in future, I want to be better. I still think, like, I'm still annoyed by the sort of, like, it still feels a bit walking simmy and so on. And that sort of is a good indication that the foundation is not really there as strongly as it could have been. That's it. There's links to other resources, other videos that go into other stuff in the description. This was a real long video. Hopefully it wasn't too long. There's so much to talk about, and I only scratched the surface. So I'll do more videos on other stuff. Hope it was interesting. Hope it was useful. Have a good day. Bye-bye.